He was standing in the doorway, right there, the front door, the one with the little brass knocker I'd polished every Sunday since 1974. He was standing in it with a bag over his shoulder, not even a suitcase really, just that old canvas duffel he used to take to baseball camp. And he looked at me with this expression I'd never quite seen on him before. Not angry, that almost would have been easier. He just looked tired. And I said something I have spent 31 years wishing I could pull back out of the air. I thought I was right at the time. I genuinely did. I thought I was being a good mother, firm, clear, the kind of woman who doesn't let things go unaddressed. Turns out I wasn't any of those things. I was just scared. And when I get scared, I've always had this terrible habit of getting hard, like an egg in boiling water. The heat was supposed to soften me, I think. That's what it does to most people, but not me. I just sat. I should back up. I should go back to before all of that. Because if I just tell you what I said in that doorway, you won't understand it the way I need you to understand it. You'll think I was just a cruel woman. And maybe that's fair. Maybe that's what I was in that moment. But I wasn't always. My son's name is Robert. Robbie, I called him, until he was about 14 and asked me very politely to please stop. He said it like that, very politely. That was always his way. Even when he was angry, even when he was hurt, there was this coating of politeness on everything he said. I used to think that was a sign of good character. Later, I wondered if it was just a sign of how unsafe he felt telling me what he really thought. That's a hard thing for a mother to sit with. He was a quiet boy, not shy. There's a difference. Shy children shrink back from things. Robbie didn't shrink. He observed. He'd walk into a room and take it all in before he said a single word. His second grade teacher called me once, asked if everything was all right at home, said he never raised his hand in class. I told her, I said my son doesn't raise his hand because he's waiting until he has something worth saying. She didn't seem too impressed by that answer, but I believed it. I still do. He was smart in that quiet way, good with his hands, too. His father, my husband Walter used to take him out to the garage on Saturday mornings, and they'd just put her around in there for hours. I'd hear them laughing sometimes through the kitchen window. Robbie didn't laugh like that with me, even then. I don't know when that started exactly. I think maybe it was always that way, and I just didn't want to see it. Walter passed in 1987. Robbie was 22, and that's when everything got complicated, I suppose is the word. You have to understand what it was like in our house after Walter died. It was like someone had turned the volume down on everything, not just the noise, the feeling of things. Walter was one of those men who just had a presence. You knew when he was in a room, and when he wasn't in it anymore, you felt the shape of where he'd been. Robbie went very still after that. He came home for the funeral, stayed 3 weeks, and then went back to the city where he was living at the time. He'd moved to Chicago 2 years before, taking a job doing something with music, some kind of small recording studio work. Honestly, I never fully understood it. When he tried to explain it to me, I'd listen, but I don't think I ever really heard him. I was always half thinking about whether the explanation made sense to me in terms of a real career, a stable life, a pension. That was my vocabulary for success. Pension, benefits, paid vacation. His vocabulary was entirely different, and I never quite made the effort to learn it. After Walter died, I kept waiting for Robbie to come back. Not physically. I mean, I knew he had his life in Chicago, but I kept waiting for him to step into something, to be more present somehow, in the family, with me. We'd talk on the phone on Sundays, usually about 15 minutes. I'd ask how he was eating. He'd ask how I was managing the house. We talked around each other like two people carefully avoiding a patch of thin ice. I think we were both grieving, and neither one of us had the language for it. And instead of reaching toward him, I started to form opinions about his choices, about his life, about the people in it. That's my great flaw.
I think when I don't understand something, instead of asking questions, I start filing it away under concern. It starts as worry, and then it curdles into judgment. And by the time I'm done, I've built a whole courtroom in my head, and I've already handed down the verdict before the other persons even had a chance to speak. There was a dinner. Christmas, 1989. Robbie came home, and he brought someone with him. His name was Daniel. Robbie introduced him as his friend, but there was something in the way he said it, just the faintest hesitation before the word, that I noticed, and then immediately put away, like a drawer I shut and leaned my whole weight against. Daniel was a lovely man, genuinely. He was soft-spoken, had a good sense of humor, brought a bottle of wine and a poinsettia, and spent 20 minutes talking to my neighbor Shirley about her garden when she came over to drop off a fruitcake. He had good manners. He was kind to me. But I was watching him the way you watch a stranger who's walked into your house uninvited. That still shames me. I pulled Robbie into the kitchen that evening while Daniel was helping Shirley with her coat. I asked him very directly what the situation was, what that meant, the two of them. And Robbie, my quiet, careful, polite son, looked at me for a long moment and said, "I think you know, Mom." I did know. I had known from the moment they walked through the door. Maybe before that, maybe some part of me had known for years and years. And I said, and I'm not proud of this, not even a little, I said, "Is this why you moved to Chicago?" He just looked at me, not angry, that thing again, just tired. "That's not a fair question," he said. And I said, "I'm your mother. I'm asking anyway." He went back to Chicago 2 days after Christmas. Daniel had left Christmas night, And Robbie and I spent those 2 days being polite to each other, which was somehow worse than fighting. We ate breakfast, and we watched the news, and we did the dishes, and we never once talked about what had happened in the kitchen. And I told myself I had handled it appropriately. Can you imagine? The real mistake, the terrible one, the one I said I'd tell you, that came about a year later. In 1990, Robbie called me on a Tuesday. He never called on a Tuesday, and his voice was different. It had that quality it used to get when he was small and something had frightened him. Not panicked, just thin, like the sound was coming from far away. He told me he had something to tell me, and I knew, before the words came, I knew what the words were going to be, because it was 1990 and his voice sounded like that, and he was 25 years old and he lived in Chicago, and I knew. He told me he'd been sick, that he'd been diagnosed, that that he was managing, but that he'd wanted me to know. And I didn't say the right thing. I wish I could tell you what the right thing would have been. I think I know now. I think it would have been something like, I love you. I'm here. Tell me what you need. 3 sentences. That's all it required. Instead, I said, how long have you known? He said a few months. And something happened in me that I'm not going to call shock, because that would be too forgiving of myself. It wasn't shock. It was a kind of cold fury, and it was directed, and this is the terrible part, this is the mistake, it was directed at him, as if he had done something to me, as if his suffering was a thing that had been inflicted on me personally, on purpose, out of carelessness or spite. I said, and you're just telling me now? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very evenly, I needed some time to figure out how to tell you. You should have told me immediately, I said. I can still hear myself saying it, the coldness in my own voice. I didn't cry. I didn't say I loved him. I didn't ask him if he was scared, even though I could hear in every syllable that he was terrified. I interrogated him about why it had taken him 3 months to tell me, as if that were the matter at hand. He said he was sorry. He apologized to me. Can you imagine that? He apologized. And I said something that, I'm going to say it plainly because I think I have to if this is going to mean anything. I said, I always worried that the life you were leaving would lead to something like this. That's what I said to my son. I thought I was being honest. I thought honesty was the most important thing. I thought I was a straight-talking woman who called things as she saw them, and that this was a virtue. But there's a difference between honesty and cruelty, and when you use one as a costume for the other, you can do damage that takes years to even measure. He said, I have to go, Mom, and he hung up. If you've ever said something in anger or in fear, which is sometimes worse, then you probably know how words can travel further than you ever expected, how they keep going long after you've forgotten you said them, long after you think the moment's passed. I didn't think it was as bad as it was. I want to be honest about that. I told myself he'd call again on Sunday, that we'd get back to normal. I convinced myself that I had been stern but appropriate, that a mother had the right to express how she felt, that he needed to hear difficult things. I talked myself into being justified. Anyway, let me tell you what happened next. He didn't call on Sunday. He didn't call the Sunday after that either. I called him once, twice. The second time I got his answering machine and I left a message that was, looking back, not exactly an apology. It was more of a statement of continued grievance disguised as an olive branch. I said something like, "I know things are hard right now, and I hope you know I'm here if you need me." Nothing about what I'd said, nothing that acknowledged it. He didn't call back. 3 months went by. I heard from my sister Patrice, who had stayed in closer contact with Robbie than I had, which I told myself I didn't mind, and actually minded enormously. I heard from her that he was doing okay, that he was getting treatment, that Daniel was with him, that he had a good doctor. And I felt, I'm ashamed of this, I felt a small, stupid jealousy toward Daniel, that Daniel was there and I wasn't, as if it were Daniel's fault, as if I hadn't done the thing that meant Robbie didn't call me. Patrice asked me once, gently, what had happened between us. I told her we'd had a disagreement. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Liz, he needs his mother right now." "He knows where I am," I said. He knew where I was, as if geography was the obstacle. About 5 months after that phone call, I was going through some boxes in the spare bedroom, the room that used to be Robbie's when he was small. I don't know why I went in there. Sometimes I did, without quite meaning to. It still had this particular smell, old wood and something that might have been his old baseball glove, and I'd stand there for a minute. I found a box of his things from when he was maybe 8 or 9 years old. There was a drawing in it, one of those children's drawings where the proportions are all off, the head's too big, the arms sticking out at wrong angles. It was the two of us, me and Robbie, standing in front of the house. He'd drawn us holding hands. He'd written our names underneath in those big crooked letters kids have before their handwriting settles, Mom and Robbie. And underneath, in that same big crooked writing, he'd written, "My best friend." I sat down on the floor of that room with that piece of paper in my hands, and I came apart, finally. I sat there on the floor of my son's old bedroom, and I cried the way I hadn't cried since Walter died. Not politely, not quietly, just completely. Because I kept thinking, when did that stop being true for him? When did I stop being his best friend? Was it gradual? Was it one specific moment? Was there something I'd said or not said years before the phone call that had already begun the pulling away? Or had I always been somewhat unavailable to him in the ways that mattered, and the warmth I remembered was just his warmth, not mine, his reaching toward me, not the other way around? I don't know the answer to that. I've never been sure. But I sat there a long time with that drawing. I called Patrice that night. I asked for Robbie's number. I'd lost it somehow during a move, which now strikes me as a kind of Freudian thing, losing your own son's phone number. She gave it to me without comment, which was generous of her. I called him on a Saturday morning. He answered. That surprised me, honestly. I had half expected the machine. His voice was different, not thin the way it had been, but careful, like he'd made a decision about how to be with me, and he was holding to it. I said, "It's Mom." He said, "I know." There was a silence, not hostile exactly, just waiting. And I said, "I've been thinking about what I said to you on the phone in March." He didn't say anything. I said, "I was wrong. I said it plainly, without dressing it up. What I said was wrong, and it was unkind, and I've thought about it nearly every day since, and I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Not, "It's okay," not, "I forgive you," just, "Thank you." And I understood that. It was honest. It was all he could give me right then, and I had no right to ask for more. We talked for about 30 minutes that morning. He told me a little about how he was doing. Not everything. He wasn't ready for everything, but enough. He told me the treatment was difficult, but that he was managing. He told me Daniel had moved in with him. I said, "I'm glad you have him." And I meant it. Truly, I meant it by then. But I want to be honest with you about something, because I've been honest about everything else. That apology, that phone call, it wasn't the end of anything. Not the beginning of a healing, not the repair. It was just a small clearing of debris. There was still so much underneath. Relationships don't bounce back the way we want them to. I think we watch too many movies, those of us of a certain generation. We expect the moment of reconciliation to mean something has been fixed, but it doesn't work like that. You can apologize and mean it, and still find months later that the damage is woven into how a person moves around you. Little hesitations, small protections they've built that you don't have the right to ask them to take down. Robbie and I found a kind of careful warmth in the years that followed. We called more often. He came home for Thanksgiving in 1992, and Daniel came with him, and I cooked too much food the way I always do, and we ate at the dining room table, and it was good, mostly. It was real. I remember watching Robbie and Daniel do the dishes after dinner, talking quietly, and thinking, my son is loved. Whatever I thought, whatever I feared, my son is loved. And I had nearly destroyed the chance to see that with my own hands, out of nothing but pride and fear, wearing the clothes of principle. Walter would have handled it so differently, I know that. Walter was the one who could sit with things he didn't understand without immediately needing to weigh in. He had that patience with Robbie that I never quite managed. I've wondered sometimes if Robbie knew somehow that telling me would be harder, whether that was part of why he left for Chicago in the first place. I never asked him that. Some questions you carry without asking. He got sicker in 1993. I flew to Chicago in February of that year. He hadn't asked me to come. It was Patrice who called me and told me I should, but I went. I remember landing at O'Hare and getting in a cab and watching the city go by through the window and feeling this particular kind of dread that I don't have words for. Not terror exactly, more like the feeling of walking toward something inevitable that you have not sufficiently prepared for. The apartment was small and warm. Daniel answered the door. He hugged me, which surprised me, and then I understood. He was relieved to see me. He'd been carrying this largely by himself, and he was tired, and I was Robbie's mother, and whatever had gone before, that still meant something. Robbie was in bed. He was thinner than I'd ever seen him, but his eyes were the same. Those same eyes he'd had as a baby, this very particular shade of brown that Walter used to call autumn-colored.
He looked up at me from that bed and he said, "Hi, Mom." Just like that. "Hi, Mom." And I sat down next to him and I took his hand, this hand that I had held when he was 3 years old crossing the street, when he was 7 and got his tonsils out, when he was 15 and Walter's father died and he cried for the first time in front of me in years. I took that hand and I said, "I'm here." And he said, "I know." I stayed 2 weeks. I learned to make his tea the way he liked it, with too much honey, which I'd never known before because I'd never paid attention before. And that small fact that I hadn't known how my own son took his tea lodged in me somewhere and has never quite come out. We watched television in the evenings. We didn't talk about deep things mostly. Sometimes I'd read to him if he was tired. Old things, things from when he was small. I'd found a copy of a book I used to read to him at bedtime, one of those chapter books about a family of mice, and he laughed when he saw it, that same laugh from the garage on Saturday mornings. I hadn't heard that laugh in so long. He passed in September of that year. I'm going to say it simply, because there's no other way to say it. He died on a Tuesday morning, which has made every Tuesday for 32 years feel slightly different to me than other days. Daniel called me. He was very kind on the phone. I flew back to Chicago and we made arrangements together. We were good to each other through all of it. He was a good man. I've thought about him often over the years. I hope he's found peace. I hope he's found some happiness somewhere. I came home to this house in October of that year, and I sat in the kitchen for I don't know how long. The quiet is a particular thing when you're grieving. It doesn't feel like silence. It feels thick, like the air itself has weight. I thought about every telephone call I'd missed, every Sunday I hadn't called, every Christmas when he'd visited and I'd been concerned about things that weren't worth being concerned about while he was standing right there in front of me. I thought about the drawing, my best friend, and I thought, I don't know when I stopped acting like one. That's the thing about regret, the really profound kind. It doesn't come with dramatic music. It just sits across from you at the kitchen table, quiet as anything, and it stays. I've had 32 years with that regret. I've done things with it. I've tried not to let it make me worse, or I've tried to let it make me better, which is a different thing from the same raw material. I became closer with Patrice. I became, I think, a more honest woman, slower to judge, not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually, the way real change usually happens, not in a moment of revelation, but in a long accumulation of smaller choices. I have a photograph of Robbie on the bookshelf in the living room. It's from his late teens. One summer, he's standing in the backyard squinting against the sun. He looks almost annoyed to be photographed, which was so like him. But there's something in the corner of his mouth that's almost a smile, like he was fighting it and losing. I talk to it sometimes when the house gets too quiet, which I know sounds strange. I tell him things I didn't say when I should have said them. I tell him I see him now. I tell him I'm sorry I made him feel like who he was something I needed to be protected from. I don't know if that helps anything. I think it helps me some. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, without it sounding like advice, because that's not what this is. I made a mistake with my son that I cannot undo. I cannot go back to that Tuesday phone call and replace my cold, frightened, pride-filled response with the response he needed and deserved. I cannot give him the years of warmth I withheld. I cannot sit back down at that Christmas table with Daniel and be the mother I should have been 10 years before I managed to become her. I thought I was protecting him. I have spent a long time understanding that I wasn't. I was protecting the picture of motherhood I had in my head, the picture of the family, the picture of a life that fit into the stories I had told about us. And when Robbie's life didn't fit that picture, I chose the picture. I chose the picture over my son. And he was gracious enough, he was, even after everything, gracious enough to let me back in a little, to let me hold his hand, to let me read to him about mice, to say, "Hi, Mom," from that bed in a way that didn't have a single ounce of bitterness in it. And I don't know how he managed that, because I'm not sure I would have. I think about the kind of man he was, the patience in him, that coating of politeness that I used to mistake for something other than what it was, which was, I think now, love, a long practiced love that had learned to step carefully around me. He loved me, even when I didn't make it easy. That's not a comfort exactly, but it's something. I'm 85 years old and I live alone in this house, and sometimes in the evenings the light comes through the kitchen window at a certain angle that I've never been able to explain. It's something about the time of year, the way the sun sits in autumn, when Robbie was small, when Walter was alive, when we were all still here together. And in that light, for just a moment, I am not a woman who made a terrible mistake. I am just a mother. If I could go back, I would listen a little longer before I spoke. I would ask more questions and make fewer pronouncements. I would try to understand that my children's lives were not chapters in a story I was writing. They were their own stories, and I was lucky to be included at all. But life doesn't work that way. You don't get to go back. All you can do is hope. Hope that the people you loved understood that you were still learning, that you were always still learning, even when you were their mother, especially then. His name was Robbie, and he was my son, and I loved him more than I knew how to show it.